Okay, in this first section of the lecture, I'd like to talk about treating and coping with chronic illness. And in this section, you're going to see a lot of connections to other lectures that we've had so far, to stress and to coping, to psychoneuroimmunology. So I hope that you look for and see those connections as we're talking about these themes here. So first, hearkening all the way back to, I believe it was our very first lecture, where we talked about the changing profile of causes of death over time, right? And so in the early 1900s, people were mostly dying of communicable diseases, things that were acute illnesses, right? We would come down with some type of bacteria or virus, and that tended to kill people relatively quickly. Whereas now we're seeing the primary causes of death being long-term chronic illnesses, particularly heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, as well as others. And so this is, really important in terms of talking about the end of life and death, but also, the chronic nature means that people live with these things for a long time, right? You don't necessarily get diagnosed with a chronic illness and be concerned about your impending death, right? You might be much more concerned about how you're going to live with that, right? And so this is what we want to talk about here first. I think kind of startlingly, perhaps you're startled by the statistic as well, 58% of Canadians have at least one, potentially more, chronic illnesses, right? So 58% are living with a chronic illness. It affects about a third of adults in the age group of 18 to 44, so that's most of us here. And so certainly there's more elderly folks with chronic illnesses, but it also is affecting a huge swath of people who are relatively young. And these range, here's a list of many of these. Certainly you don't need to memorize these, but this is just some of the many chronic illnesses that are impacting people around the world, but also Canadians, right? So asthma, fibromyalgia, arthritis or rheumatism, back pain, hypertension, migraines, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, ulcers, effects of stroke, bowel disorders like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. I'll be using those as examples a lot in this lecture because those are the ones that run in my family. Alzheimer's, myalgic encephalomyelitis, we'll be talking about that. That used to be chronic fatigue syndrome, but now the name that we use for it is, again, myalgic encephalomyelitis. We can call it ME for short. Endometriosis, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, Parkinson's, ALS, MS, etc., etc. Right? This list goes on. And you can see mixed in this, right, that we consider chronic illnesses, both ones that are usually considered physical illnesses as well as things that are mental illnesses. But of course we know that these things are interconnected as well, right? Should we consider Alzheimer's a physical illness or a mental disorder? Well, certainly it's a physical thing that affects the brain, and so it has mental effects. And as health psychologists, I think we know by now that all physical and mental processes are interactive, and so we don't really, doesn't work for us to make a distinction between those. We would consider all of these chronic illnesses. So just, another startling statistic is that most of us, about 80%, will develop a chronic disease in our lifetime. So if you are lucky enough to not have one yet, again, we likely will develop one. And while this is a sort of terrifying to think about, this is a result of the fact that we're not dying of other things that would have killed us sooner. So I also think that this is doesn't have to be as scary as it might be framed as, right? This is because most of us will live a long time, long enough to develop something that goes wrong with our body because we've lived a long life. These do range from mild to severe, right? I said what runs in my family is gastrointestinal autoimmune disorders, so your body attacks its own intestinal tract, and so that can range from really severe to more mild. I'm really lucky to have probably the most mild case in our family, whereas many of my cousins have had sections of their intestines and colon are removed because it's been eaten away by their own body. I'm lucky enough to just, spend a lot more time on the toilet and have to watch what I eat a lot more than most people, right? So I certainly, it affects me in my daily life, but not to the same extent as someone with more severe symptoms, right? So chronic illnesses covers a lot of different things here. So again, when we talk about 80% of us will develop those, again, they can really range in the impact that they have on your life and how severe they are. and we're still discovering new ones all the time, right? I read that really long list, but we're finding new chronic illnesses and diagnosing them all the time, things that we weren't previously aware of, again, potentially because we didn't have the technology to detect them, or because, again, people are exposed to new kinds of toxins. And also, again, we're living longer and so susceptible to new things that we were not aware of before. An example of a relatively new discovery of a chronic illness is that people can contract chronic Lyme disease, right? We've been aware of Lyme disease. It's a tick-borne disease for a long time, but now we know that people can develop this in a chronic nature and can have a long-term impact on their immune system, and basically incites all sorts of inflammatory processes around the body that can look like all kinds of different disorders. And so this can be a really difficult thing to diagnose and also to treat and to cope with, because it basically wreaks havoc on the body in all sorts of different ways, and it's not clearly yet why it impacts different people in different ways. So again, this is a relatively new discovery of a chronic illness. And even more recently, they've learned that, although Lyme disease is a tick-borne disease, right, it comes from that particular insect. Now we know that chronic Lyme disease can be passed between people through a sexual contact as well. And so, we're learning new things about these illnesses all the time. So this is a really important area for health psychologists as well as other health professionals to be looking at. Turning back to talking about what used to be, we used to call this chronic fatigue syndrome, but now we call it myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME. And this is a really fascinating but terrible a disease, and so that we're gaining more understanding about all the time, but is a really good but sad example of a chronic illness and of a lot of the issues that surround a chronic illness that we're going to be talking about in this lecture, about misdiagnosis, about stigma. This is one that really faces both of those things at really high rates, because this is chronic fatigue syndrome, again, as we used to call it, or ME presents itself again in different ways in different people, and so it can be really difficult to diagnose. One thing we know now is that people usually get this after getting sick with something else, and then for reasons that remain relatively unclear, they have a really strange immune reaction to that, and it shifts how their body reacts, and then they're really never the same again after that, and it then suffer long-term effects where basically you have very little energy. So it's like if you were a cell phone, to use that metaphor, your battery is kind of always at 5 or 10%, but if you overexert yourself and that phone crashes, you take a long time to recover from that, and there can be major flare-ups when that occurs. And so this is a really a devastating thing. And so to tell you more about that in better terms, I've linked a video on our weekly page where Jennifer Brea talks about this in a TED Talk, and she's someone who suffers from this, but has also really become an expert in the area and an expert advocate for people with this, because this is a disease that particularly faces a lot of stigma, which is part of why we don't call it chronic fatigue syndrome anymore, because it's really not just about being tired, right? There's all kinds of inflammatory processes in the body. It's not about being tired or lazy, but that is often the stigma that we apply to people with chronic illness, that maybe if they just tried this or worked harder or did that, then they could heal themselves. And that really, as we're learning more and more, is not the case. So you can watch that there, and then if that interests you, if you watch that video and that's something that you find interesting, then you might also she has a documentary that she created that's available on Netflix and iTunes. That's very powerful if you're interested in this topic. And in this was something that we used to think was really, really rare, but it's something that actually affects 15 to 30 million people around the world and an estimated 400,000 Canadians. And this is a place where the internet has really changed our understanding understanding of this. So previously, people who had this kind of had to retreat into their homes. They had no energy or very sensitive to light. And so we were really unaware of the extent to which people were suffering from this. And in part because of people like Jennifer Breyer reaching out to others and forming these groups, we're learning more and more how many people are affected by this and how they've been treated by the medical field. It's very, again, difficult to get a diagnosis of this type of illness. Again, we can also see here important health psychology themes in terms of intersections with people and their psychology and their personality, as well as their demographic status. And ME is something that is much more likely to affect women than men, and that's been both part of the source of stigma around that and has been a barrier to getting treatment and getting funding for looking at these things. And so again, I'll leave you to watch Jennifer Breyer much more articulately tell you more about these important issues. But this is, I think, a really again, good but tough example to think about when we think about chronic illness. This is really one that's faced some of the most stigma and some of the most failures in diagnosis, and so is a good example of what barriers people face when they have a chronic illness. Right, so this is an organizing slide here. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on just each of these topics. I've already mentioned misdiagnosis and stigma. We'll also talk about just some of the impact on daily life. Certainly, you can imagine having a chronic illness has an impact on daily life. And again, that'll range depending on the range of symptoms that you experience with your chronic illness and what that is. I'll be using spoon theory to talk about that a bit. It's not really an academic theory, but it's really more of a metaphor for thinking about the impact on daily life and how having a chronic illness impacts energy levels and ability to engage in different activities. Also the impact on relationships and self-concept as well. These are also going to be key concerns that face people who are diagnosed with chronic illness. And so first, the issue of misdiagnosis. I think this was something that was kind of hard for me to believe at first when I was reading all the stats on misdiagnosis in chronic illness. I'm someone who has a lot of trust in the medical field. For better or worse, we can all have different perceptions of that. But my understanding was that if something was wrong with me, I would go in and someone would really care and want to investigate that down to the level to figure that out. And while there certainly are many professionals who do feel that way and will do that for you, we also, because of how medical systems work, doctors are often overtaxed, and also we don't have as strong of an understanding of a lot of these chronic illnesses, and many of them present themselves in ways that are difficult to detect. And so, often on TV and shows like House or other doctor shows, they will go to the ends of the earth and to investigate your apartment, look for toxins there, and really work until they can't anymore to figure out what is wrong with you, that they love a mystery and want to solve it. But often in real life, that's not what happens for people, particularly people who are disadvantaged in other ways, right? So here we're seeing an intersection with our lecture on stigma and SES, right? People who have fewer resources and less quality medical care and more overtaxed physicians, right? If you're going to a free clinic, you're going to see a doctor who might have seen 40, 50 patients that day, and they may not have time to do the level of investigation or energy to do that to diagnose your symptoms. And again, because these often present in women, and because again of stigma and bias, their symptoms are often taken less seriously. People often have the experience that they go in and talk about symptoms with their physician and are told, that you might be making this up, try some antidepressants, try, managing your stress. And well, certainly I think we can all manage our stress better, right? Sometimes there's something physiological that's going on as well that needs to be addressed. Often if people are overweight, we can see another intersection with stigma here, that it's chalked up to be because of that, and that can be an issue as well, right? So sometimes being overweight is related to your health issue. Certainly that can be related to diabetes. Sometimes it's totally totally unrelated, and it's just there's something that's totally separate that's going on from your weight. And sometimes being overweight is a symptom of some other issue that's going on in the body. And so we really don't want to be using that as a heuristic of, oh, well, if you lose weight, then you're going to solve this issue, right? So this is not necessarily going to work. And so very often people who have chronic illnesses spend a long time trying to get a diagnosis and may not be able to. And so it's really difficult to be able to treat that if you don't know what's wrong. And even for things that are well established, right, like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, even those there's no question as to whether those exist as illnesses, unlike some of the rarer ones. Most or all doctors know about this, but it can still be really difficult to diagnose because of how those symptoms present themselves. And so, I've had friends who've waited 2 or 3 years to find out that that's what they have, and that's something that could have been treated a lot sooner, and then they wouldn't have required surgery or more advanced treatment if they could have managed it sooner. Right? So these are difficult to diagnose. Again, I've already talked a lot about stigma, but certainly there's a lot of stigma with chronic illnesses, because people have them for a long time. Often they're not visible, and also because people do have, particularly with autoimmune disorders, people have flare-ups and times that they're better. And so it can be difficult for people who haven't had that type of experience to understand why someone is frequently sick or why they might be fine one day and not okay the next. And so there's a lot of stigma that can be put on people because of that. If you think back again to our stigma lecture and our 2 dimensions in terms of visibility and control, right? So chronic illnesses are often not very visible, but then also believed to be under people's control, and so that sets them at a likely to face a lot of stigma because of that, right? To the extent that people think you can just snap out of it, they're more likely to treat you negatively. I have this comic here just to kind of illustrate that, right? But so all these soldiers are dead on the field. How do we know if they're just pretending? And the other guy yells, I have a chronic illness, and everyone says, try kale, essential oils, yoga, juice cleanse, and things like that, right? And you're seeing here kind of that attitude that people often face who have chronic illnesses of people being, oh, well, why don't you just do this or just do that? And it's like, if it were that simple, they likely, would have solved that. But many of these things, certainly, we could all eat healthier and do more exercise, but again, these are not cures for chronic illnesses. These may be things that might help people cope, but you can see the stigma in that in terms of in terms of the assumption that people have control over these illnesses and can cure them if they just try hard enough. And turning to impact on daily life, right? I think that's easy to imagine the fact that there's an impact if you're sick and in pain a lot. But I think a great way to illustrate that is through this spoon theory. Again, this is really more of a metaphor than a theory. And this comes from Christine Miserando, and you can check out more about this. She's got a website there, and I think I put the links on our weekly page as well. But it's a way of talking about the impact that this has on your ability to engage in the basic tasks of life when you're chronically ill. And so you can think about, every morning you wake up and you have some amount of energy that's available to you. And people, whether they're ill or not, have different amounts of energy that's available to them. Some people are very energetic. They wake up feeling really rested and they're ready to go. Some people might be really tired and depleted. And when you're ill, right, you're likely to have a lot less of that energy. And so we can conceptualize that energy as spoons. The reason it's spoons is just because the first time that this woman came up with this, she was at a diner, and that was something that she had available to just illustrate the amount of something, right? So you can just say, imagine that a healthy person wakes up with 20 spoons, and somebody else who has a chronic illness wakes up with only 12, right? And each activity that you engage in takes up some number of spoons. And it also, the activities that you engage in will take up a different number of spoons depending on how ill you are, right? So if I'm, really healthy, then it might take no spoons at all to get out of bed and to get dressed, or it might take only, 1 spoon, whereas someone who's very, very sick, that might take many spoons to get out of bed. That could take, most of the spoons that you have just to get out of the bed that day. And so you could think about people who are more ill having fewer spoons, but also requiring more spoons to engage in every task. And so this diagram here just shows like one example of what this might look like for someone. Right? Perhaps it just takes one spoon to get out of bed and get dressed and take pills. And to watch TV, it takes more spoons to do things that take more effort, like bathing, styling their hair, reading and studying, doing more cognitive activities. And it could take quite a lot of spoons to go shopping, go to school or work, or to exercise. Right? And people who are chronically ill are really have to calculate and think about, what am I going to do today so that I don't run out of spoons? Because unlike those of us who are healthy, someone who's chronically ill, when they run out of spoons, it's not like they can borrow from the next day in the same way that we might, right? We might push really hard one day and then just be a bit tired the next. But because of how autoimmune disorders work and inflammatory processes for chronic illnesses, once you run out of those spoons, you are more likely to have a flare-up, and so to have more pain the next day. And so it doesn't work in the same way where you can really push, and so you have to be really careful about what activities you engage in and how much energy they're going to take up. And so you might decide, today I'm only going to make it to the grocery store, and like that's what I'm going to be able to do. And if I do that, I won't be able to exercise, or I won't be able to go to work. And so have to really think about what those different costs are. So impact on daily life, stigma, misdiagnosis, and then chronic illnesses can have a major impact on relationships, right? So when you're sick a lot, that certainly impacts those around you as well as yourself, right? It can be difficult to be the partner of someone who's chronically ill, and needing to support them, seeing them in pain a lot. Maybe they can't do the things that they used to do. So there's a lot of impact on people's relationships, and that can be really difficult. And particularly because one of the most important things to cope well with a chronic illness is having social support. Right? You need social support both for all of the instrumental things that you're likely to need help with. Right? If you have fewer spoons, then you might need people to assist with some of those tasks, to be making meals, helping to clean your home, engaging in those things that you might not be able to do because you're chronically ill. And so that's a really important thing to have, and yet having this can make those relationships more difficult. And so having supportive partners and friends is a really important predictor of coping and adjustment in people with chronic illnesses. It also has a really strong impact on people's self-concept, particularly more severe chronic illnesses. So they have an impact on the activities that you're able to engage in, right? And many of our identities are based on the things that we do, right? So you might be quite an athlete and then get diagnosed with ME and not be able to do that at all anymore, right? So a big piece of adjusting to chronic illnesses is sorting out how your identity is impacted by that, and finding a new identity if that's necessary, and finding new aspects of yourself that give you a sense of self-concept, right? So if you're not able to engage in sports anymore, or if you're not able to travel in the same way, for example, finding other ways to exert your passions and your interests that do work with what you have available to you. These are really key concerns. And so how do we cope with chronic illnesses? Well, pretty much using many of the strategies that we discussed for how we cope with stress in general. One of the main theories about coping with chronic illnesses is the stress and coping theory. We'll see that on the next slide, but that it's really who copes well is really about how people respond to the additional stressors that they have because they have a chronic illness, right? Pain is a source of stress, all of the other, the need to go to doctor's appointments, the toll it takes on our relationships, all of those are stressors, and so how we cope with stress has a really strong impact on how we cope with chronic illness. And so we can apply a lot of those same strategies, as well as strategies for how we cope with pain. Right, that's one of the big issues with chronic illnesses is that people are in pain a lot with them, and so how we can help them cope with that pain. We may not be able to cure the source of that pain, but we may be able to help them cope with that pain through strategies like relaxation, biofeedback, acupuncture, as well as turning to more emotion-focused processes as well, helping people to cope with the feelings that they have about the chronic illness and their need to adjust to their new identity and to any restrictions that are on their lifestyle now. Other things around coping, right? We've talked previously about problem-focused versus emotion-focused coping, right? And so we can think of these in the literature also as sort of these active versus more passive coping strategies, right? Are we trying to change the situation itself, or are we coping with the situation and how we're reacting to that and our emotions in response to that situation? Both are really key for coping with chronic illness. Which should be emphasized more is really going to depend on that illness, on that person, on what they're struggling with, right? So, for some people, we might really want to be focused on, how they can actively cope in terms of, adapting physically to the situation. What kind of new supports can we put in place so that they can still engage in as many of the activities as they want as possible? Is there a way we can adjust the pedals in their car so they can still drive, right? Really thinking in this problem-focused way. But then also we really want to, some things are not going to be possible. Some changes are going to need to be lasting. We may need to adapt in ways that involve really focusing on our emotions and grieving the sense of self that we may have lost and processing that. And so both of these are going to be really key to coping with chronic illness. And again, I said on the previous slide, we talked about that social support is key. Although relationships may be taxed, having supportive relationships is one of the key predictors in coping well with chronic illness. And so wanted to put that here again, just to reemphasize that as really being, it's the number one predictor of well-being for people who are not chronically ill, and that doesn't change for people who are chronically ill. That's still the most important factor here. So then we can think about psychological adjustment to chronic illness. This is really the goal, right? With chronic illnesses, the goal is not to cure them because we don't usually know how. Certainly people, that is the goal of researchers who that's their career, is to try to develop cures for this. But as the physician treating the person with this chronic illness, your goal is to help them to cope with that and to reach a state of psychological adjustment. And what they mean by psychological adjustment is, So what they mean by psychological adjustment here is people's ability to engage in functional tasks of daily life, and that includes being able to engage in their relationships, in certain activities, as well as being able to work if that's a goal for that person, and then also their psychological well-being. So having relatively high levels of positive affect and low levels of negative affect and satisfaction with their life and with their emotions, right? So really looking at adjustment in a multifaceted way in terms of physical and functional and emotional health. And so there's many theories that try to predict who's going to have the best psychological adjustment, and there's several that are discussed in the article, but really they share many of the same principles at heart, right? So the stress and coping model is one that's really relevant to what we talk about in this class, that really emphasizes that who copes well with chronic illness is people who cope well with stress, emphasizing strategies for coping with all the additional stressors that are posed by having a chronic illness. And so this model really emphasizes the role of appraisal processes, right? Thinking back to that transactional model of stress, that how we perceive situations, how we think about our ratio of resources relative to the demands of the situation impact whether we even perceive stress in the first place, and then also our reappraisal processes, right? How we shift our perceptions of that in ways that are adaptive. These are really key pieces of this model and predictors of people's adjustment to chronic illness. And then recently we've updated this model and added self-regulation to it, which really this idea is saying almost the same thing, but emphasizing additionally this really proactive response to illness, where you could think of, the transactional model of stress and appraisal processes and stress and coping as sort of a reaction to when you face a stressor. This self-regulation addition here emphasizes that rather than just reacting to stressors those who cope well with chronic illnesses prepare for those and have proactive responses in terms of how they structure their life and regulate themselves and manage their lives that also lead to better psychological adjustment. And we'll see some of that in the factors that we talk about on the next slides. Right, but really these do share the key piece in common, that they both highlight that there's this active role of the patient. Right? It's not just about the illness that you have and what your specific diagnosis is, and certainly those are important factors in your experience, but that the patient has an active agentic role in their response to this illness and how they perceive that and how they respond to that stress and how they prepare for that stress and how they organize their life that has that's key predictors of outcomes that follow. So the key factors that are talked about in terms of predicting psychological adjustment, and this comes from that article that you read for this week, are activity and cytokines, emotion regulation, self-management, and cognitive processing and benefit finding. And I'll have a slide on each of these in this next section here. So the first key factor being activity and cytokines. And so one of the things with chronic illness is that you have a lot of pro-inflammatory cytokines around your body. And as you probably remember from our pain lecture, these sensitize the nervous system to experiencing more pain. They also mediate what we call a disease-induced inactivity. And this is the sickness behavior that people have, right? So when you're ill, you want to lay in bed. You usually feel kind of down and sad and exhausted. It's cytokines that lead to that behavior, right? And in the short term, that's really adaptive, right? When you have the flu, you need to hunker down. You need to not infect other people, and you need to rest and heal. But for long-term chronic illnesses, this is no longer adaptive, right? Hunkering down and healing may help for like a flare-up, but on the whole, right, you need to get on with the business of living. In fact, often what's most beneficial to helping to reduce the level of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the body is exercise. That reduces those, but unfortunately, having many of these in the bloodstream leads people often to low activity, right, as part of those sickness behaviors, and also because if you've been experiencing chronic pain, you might be trying to avoid experiencing more of that, and you have an association of engaging in activity with leading to more pain, and so you may avoid those activities. And while certainly some activities may lead to pain, there may be things that you can be doing, exercise that can be tailored to your capabilities and your illness, and this can be a really important way a proactive mechanism that can reduce those levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, lead to more flexibility, and lead to, and through all the other things we've talked about in terms of the benefits of exercise, improve your health. So this is a really important area, right, where we need to both acknowledge the limitations that are imposed by the disease and that may limit the kinds of activities that people can engage in, right? If you're in chronic pain, you may not be able to do certain types of activities, but there may be things that you can do. And so to the extent that we can tailor activities to people, this is going to be a beneficial point of intervention. Oops. Next is emotion regulation, and right, we've already touched on a lot of this, but we talked about previously in this course, we've talked about there's emotion-focused and problem-focused coping. Here, we're talking really about the emotion-focused coping when we're talking about emotion regulation, right? And we can think about two broad types of that in terms of avoidance or inhibition or suppressing those emotions versus expressing and acknowledging and processing them. And so there's a lot of evidence that suggests that, particularly within Western cultures, expressing those emotions rather than suppressing them leads to better psychological adjustment, right? So people who don't acknowledge those emotions tend to leave them leave them unresolved. And while they may not report that they're feeling badly, they show a lot of sympathetic nervous system activity indicative of stress, right? And that's going to lead to, guess what? More pro-inflammatory cytokines and other issues are related to stress that exacerbate that chronic illness. So processing emotions can be a really important intervention for helping people to adjust to chronic illness. There has, however, been some interesting cross-cultural research on this that suggests that it may not just be that it's the emotional expression part of it, but that may be additionally beneficial because most of this research done in Western cultures, right, that's a value that we have. Expressing emotions is something that is highly valued. And so it may be about cultural fit that in some less expressive cultures, being less expressive may be what leads to better adjustment. So essentially, expressing emotions in the way that fits within your culture is associated with more a psychological adjustment. And so there's lots of interest in, at least in Western cultures, emotion disclosure interventions, right? If this is something that helps people to adjust better, then we want to promote this. And so there's been a lot of focus on this. Right? And so the expression of emotion, it needs to be processed to be beneficial. All right, so it's not just expressing the emotion, like yelling or screaming about it. Right, you need to be thinking through it and processing that and coming to terms with that. That's really the key piece of what's beneficial about this type of emotion regulation. And so, one of the types of interventions that surrounds that is things like expressive writing, where the person journals multiple times a week and really tries to dig deep into what they're feeling and why they're feeling that. And that can be a way to help people to really process their emotions and to come to terms with the really difficult things that they're facing with a chronic illness. Next, we have self-management. This is a really key one, right? We've talked so much in this course about all the different health behaviors and why it's so hard to do them. It's hard to manage your diet. It's hard to exercise. It's hard to just stick to a plan. But if you have a chronic illness, there's so many things that you need to do to manage that. You need to be on a medication regimen. You may need to take pills every day. You may need to give yourself injections. You may need to do certain physical therapy every day. You may need to engage in a really restrictive diet, right? These are really difficult things to do. These are really difficult changes to make, particularly ones that we refer to as lifestyle changes. Things like really changing how you eat or really changing the kinds of activities that you engage in. This, you have to change your life around for that, and that's difficult to do. And so being able to self-manage in this way and engage in these behaviors, being able to take charge of that has been linked to psychological adjustment. But of course, this is a bi-directional relationship, right? People who are more psychologically adjusted are more able to engage in self-management. But at the same time, it's been shown that interventions that enhance ability to self-manage and people are able to gain more control of that enhances adjustment, right? If you think about coping, having more control in your life is associated with better outcomes. And so helping people to feel more of this control is a really key point of intervention again. The last of these key factors is cognitive processing. And this one relates a bit to the emotion expression and the processing around that, but this is really focused more on the thoughts around that and your cognitive processing around that. And so one of the factors here that's really strongly related to psychological adjustment is what we call post-traumatic growth and benefit finding. This is something we talk a lot about in my positive psychology course as well as part of the resilience that people have. And that this is a really fascinating finding that, although people with chronic illnesses have all kinds of things that are impacting their health, they have poorer health than other people, their mental well-being is the same as or higher than healthy matched controls, right? People, while they're suffering physically, still are leading very meaningful and happy lives. And so what's going on there and what researchers what research indicates is that people are engaging in these processes of benefit finding and growth where they find something positive out of this situation. They process that in a way such that they change what their values are for what constitutes a healthy and good life, what their values and goals are, and what's important to them in ways that allow them to still be very happy and to lead meaningful lives. And so this is what we call a response shift, and this is a major predictor of adjustment. In the text you read, they differentiate between these three different types: recalibration, reprioritization, and reconceptualization. They're all very similar. I won't ask you anything about differentiating those, because if you think about it, what constitutes health and a good life is very much related to what your values and goals are, and that's very much related to what's important to maintain an acceptable quality of life. So really all of those things together are this response shift where you really change what's important to you, and this can actually lead people to find a lot more meaning in their daily lives. And so this is a key predictor. And so expressive writing is also an important intervention for this as well, right? So in addition to processing those emotions, you also are really processing just and at a cognitive level what's going on and looking for benefits. And people often through the process of writing write about things that they've learned from this in ways that they've grown and changed and start to see some of these positive things. Importantly, there is a curvilinear relationship between the threat or the stress or the illness that people have experienced and their level of post-traumatic growth. And by curvilinear, I mean like this, right? So up to a certain point, more stress and threat can lead to more growth, but certainly there are types of things that people face that are so overwhelming that doesn't lead to this growth. But in general, really, potentially a surprising amount of people really grow and benefit ultimately from facing these difficult things, right? So while their health may suffer, their well-being doesn't. So again, these have really important implications for interventions, these four different key factors. I've already sort of talked about these a bit in talking about the factors, but just to re-highlight them here with activity, right? We really want to acknowledge the limitations that are imposed by the disease, but also really promote tailored activity, right? So we don't, we used to really recommend rest a lot for all of these things. Now we recommend certainly, enough rest, but also enough activity to keep that person mobile, to keep them pushing, to keep levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines down. Emotion regulation, right? We can have people engage in things like mindfulness to enhance more acknowledgement and acceptance of really, really difficult emotions that you might be facing. People might also, engage in therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy for emotion regulation, as well as cognitive processing to help them, better get in touch with those. Self-management, right? We can have occupational therapy and other health psychology interventions to help people build their skills and their self-efficacy so they feel like they have more control. And then, for cognitive processing, again, sort of overlapping with a lot of the emotion regulation work, cognitive behavioral therapy, and expressive writing to help people really confront their negative thoughts and also to think about some of the potential things that they have learned and some of the benefits that they may be experiencing from their situation. So I'm going to stop there, and then in the next section we'll turn to talking about our next topic, which is what it means to have a good death and what people are looking for at the end of life in order to have the best possible end of life experience. So see you in the next video.